I am 82 years old now, sitting on a porch that overlooks a quiet, sunlit valley, but my mind often drifts back to a freezing November morning in 1952, the exact moment my childhood shattered, and a seed of relentless, burning anger was planted deep within my chest. I was just 9 years old, a boy who still believed in the invincibility of his father, when he packed a single leather duffel bag in the dead of night, the metallic scrape of the zipper sounding impossibly loud in our tiny, drafty house. He didn't wake me, he didn't leave a note, and he certainly didn't offer any explanations to my mother, who stood shivering in the doorway, her face pale and etched with a terrifying silent grief as she watched the taillights of his battered Ford fade into the biting winter fog. For weeks, I sat by the front window, pressing my face against the cold glass until condensation blurred my vision, convinced that it was all a terrible mistake and that he would return with that booming laugh and a pocket full of cheap hard candies. But the days bled into weeks, the weeks into months, and the crushing reality of his abandonment settled over our home like a thick, suffocating layer of dust. The financial ruin he left behind was immediate and brutal. My mother worked 3 grueling jobs, her hands becoming cracked and bleeding from harsh scrubbing chemicals, while I took on odd jobs before and after school, sweeping floors and delivering papers and shoes that were 2 sizes too small and stuffed with newspaper to keep out the snow. Every time I saw a boy throwing a baseball with his dad in the park, every time a teacher asked about my family, every time I saw the exhaustion etched into my mother's prematurely aging face, the confusion in my heart curdled into a dark, potent rage that tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I began to construct a narrative in my head, a defense mechanism built of pure spite, convincing myself that I didn't need him, that his absence was a fuel I could burn to propel myself forward. But underneath that bravado was a wounded, desperate child crying out for validation. I swore to myself then and there, with the fierce, unbending conviction that only a betrayed child can muster, that I would become everything he wasn't, that I would build an empire of success so vast and undeniable that one day he would be forced to crawl back to me, begging for my forgiveness on his knees. That silent vow became the defining architecture of my life, a heavy armor I wore every single day, completely unaware that this self-righteous anger, which I thought was protecting me from further pain, was actually building the walls of a prison that would keep me trapped in that freezing November morning for the next 6 decades of my life. The anger became my closest companion, a whispering shadow that followed me through the turbulent years of my adolescence and into the rigorous demands of early adulthood, providing a toxic but incredibly effective fuel that drove me to achieve things no one ever expected from the poor, abandoned kid from the wrong side of the tracks. I threw myself into my education with a terrifying, obsessive ferocity, treating every exam, every assignment, and every academic milestone not as a stepping stone to a better life, but as a weapon I was carefully forging to eventually use against the man who had discarded us so casually. When my peers were out at parties, experiencing the carefree joys of youth, falling in love and making mistakes, I was hunched over borrowed textbooks in the dim light of the local library, driven by a relentless, punishing internal monologue that demanded absolute perfection because anything less would somehow validate his decision to leave. This singular burning focus propelled me through university on full scholarships and straight into the cutthroat world of corporate finance, where my lack of emotional attachment and my ruthless drive to succeed made me a formidable force, allowing me to climb the ladder with a speed that left my colleagues bewildered and intimidated. I amassed wealth, I bought the tailored suits, I drove the expensive cars, and I purchased a sprawling home for my mother, desperate to erase the lines of hardship from her face and prove unequivocally that we had triumphed despite his cowardly desertion. Yet, no matter how much money accumulated in my bank accounts or how many titles were appended to my name, The gnawing emptiness inside me refused to be filled because every single achievement was secretly dedicated to an audience of one who wasn't even there to witness it. I found myself obsessively scanning crowds in busy city streets, jumping at the sight of a familiar gait or the tilt of a fedora, half hoping and half dreading that I would lock eyes with him, playing out the confrontation a million times in my head with cinematic precision. In these elaborate mental rehearsals, he was always broken, destitute, and drowning in regret, while I stood tall, cold, and unforgiving, finally delivering the devastating monologue of righteous condemnation I had been writing and rewriting since I was 9 years old, watching as the realization of his monumental mistake crushed his spirit completely. I didn't realize that in my desperate attempt to punish him through my own success, I was allowing him to dictate every major decision I made, handing over the keys to my happiness to a ghost, and completely blinding myself to the fact that the fire of resentment I was so carefully tending was slowly burning away my own capacity for joy, vulnerability, and genuine human connection. As the years turned into decades, the narrative of the impending apology became an obsession, a foundational myth upon which I had built my entire identity, and I found myself subconsciously orchestrating my life to ensure I would be in the perfect position of power when the inevitable day of reckoning finally arrived. I married a wonderful, patient woman and had 2 beautiful children, but even in the quiet, tender moments of fatherhood, when I should have been entirely present, a part of my mind was always partitioned off, reserved for the simmering resentment that I guarded like a precious, sacred flame. Whenever my own children looked at me with unconditional trust, a sudden sharp spike of rage would pierce my heart as I remembered the betrayal I had suffered, prompting me to overcompensate by being overly strict and emotionally guarded, terrified that any display of softness would somehow make me vulnerable to the same kind of devastation. My wife, sensing the impenetrable wall I had built around my core, would often gently urge me to let it go, to seek therapy, or to simply talk about the pain. But I rebuffed her with defensive hostility, entirely convinced that abandoning my anger would be tantamount to absolving him of his crimes. The fantasy of the apology evolved. It was no longer just about him seeing my success, but about him acknowledging the specific, agonizing contours of my pain, about him looking me in the eye and admitting that he was a coward, a failure of a man who had destroyed his own family out of sheer selfishness. I needed to hear the words, "I am sorry," more than I needed oxygen. I convinced myself that those 3 words were the magical incantation that would finally unlock the heavy iron gates of my emotional prison, the only cure for the chronic, low-grade depression that haunted my days and the relentless insomnia that tortured my nights. I actively hired private investigators to track him down, spending exorbitant amounts of money just to keep tabs on his whereabouts, discovering he had started a new, entirely unremarkable life in a different state, which only poured gasoline on the fire of my indignation. How dare he live a normal life? How dare he simply exist, perhaps even finding moments of happiness, while I was condemned to carry this suffocating boulder up a hill every single day, waiting for a closure that he owed me by every law of the universe? I was so deeply entrenched in my role as the righteous victim that I completely failed to see how I was perpetuating my own suffering, gripping the jagged edges of my trauma so tightly that my hands were constantly bleeding, utterly terrified of who I would even be without the defining gravity of my lifelong, unquenchable anger. The devastating climax I had spent over 40 years meticulously preparing for arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, tears of regret, or a begged apology, but with a sterile, brief phone call from a stranger on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1996, casually informing me that the man I had simultaneously hated and waited for my entire life had passed away from a sudden heart attack. I remember sitting perfectly still in my lavish corner office, the phone receiver feeling heavy and cold against my ear, as the world around me seemed to tilt on its axis and plunge into a terrifying absolute silence, while the meticulously constructed scaffolding of my entire emotional existence collapsed into dust in a single heartbeat. There was no grand revelation, no final moment of clarity, no bedside confession where he reached out a trembling hand and begged for my forgiveness. He simply ceased to exist, taking the apology I so desperately craved, the apology I felt entitled to, the apology I had built my entire life around receiving, with him into the dark permanence of the grave. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't feel the sudden cathartic release of a lifelong burden being lifted. Instead, I felt a horrifying, cavernous void open up inside my chest, a sense of being entirely unmoored, as if the compass I had used to navigate every aspect of my life had suddenly lost its magnetic north. I attended the funeral out of a grim, mechanical sense of obligation, standing in the back of a sparsely populated chapel, looking at the cheap wooden casket and feeling an overwhelming, suffocating sense of being cheated out of the one thing I truly wanted, the ultimate victory I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to secure. The anger, which had always been a sharp, burning, directional force, suddenly had nowhere to go, no target to lock onto, and so it turned inward, becoming a toxic, corrosive sludge that began to eat away at my own soul, leaving me more bitter, more isolated, and more deeply depressed than I had ever been when he was alive. I realized with a sickening sense of dread that he had escaped. He had lived his life, made his choices, and exited the stage without ever having to face the consequences of his actions, while I was left holding the bag, entirely consumed by a poison I had been drinking for decades while waiting for him to die. The devastating truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The waiting was over. The hope for reconciliation or even just acknowledgement was permanently dead, and I was now trapped in a cage of my own making, realizing far too late that the apology I had demanded was never going to come, and I had absolutely no idea how to survive without it. For years after his death, the anger mutated into a heavy, suffocating shroud that colored every interaction, every thought, and every waking moment of my life, proving that you do not need a living antagonist to remain entirely enslaved by a grudge. The ghost of my father proved to be a far more formidable enemy than the man himself, because I could no longer direct my fantasies toward a future confrontation. Instead, I was trapped in a relentless, agonizing loop of the past, replaying every memory, every perceived slight, and the ultimate injustice of his painless exit from the world. My relationships began to crumble under the immense weight of my unresolved grief and displaced rage. My wife, who had stood by me through decades of my emotional unavailability, finally reached her breaking point, her eyes filled with a profound sadness, as she told me she could no longer live in a house haunted by a man who was already dead. The separation was a brutal wake-up call, but even losing the family I had built wasn't enough to immediately pierce the thick armor of my resentment as I stubbornly doubled down, convincing myself that I was profoundly misunderstood, entirely alone in my suffering, and uniquely justified in my perpetual state of bitterness. I retired early, retreating into an isolated, solitary existence in a house that felt too large and too quiet, spending my days sitting in an armchair, staring at the walls, and physically feeling the toll that 70 years of sustained fury had taken on my body.